This case was against an apartment complex on behalf of a young lady who had just moved out of her house. She was on her own, living in an apartment, and one day when she was getting ready to get in the shower, she turned on the nozzle to get water coming out. It was coming out of the bathtub. She takes her clothes off, and all of a sudden she has a grand mal seizure. She falls into the bathtub where she remains for approximately 3 minutes or so, and she literally cooks her chest and her stomach under scalding hot water.
Welcome to the Law Talk Podcast, where we take you behind the curtains of a successful personal injury law firm. This season, attorneys at Hollis Wright will discuss several comeback stories involving real clients of the firm. Find out through specific cases and clients how the Hollis Wright attorneys turn oftentimes catastrophic injuries and situations into comeback stories. Follow along as attorneys detail various cases, including how the injury occurred, how the firm thoroughly investigated the case, how the firm provided the best possible outcome for the client, and how the client is today. Welcome into the Law Talk Podcast. I'm David Lamb along with Carter Clay from the firm of Hollis Wright. Good to see you, sir.
Good to see you, David. I'm happy to be here.
Really looking forward to our conversation because how hot is too hot is kind of what we're talking about. And springing off with a case that was a phenomenon. I don't know what the date was on this, but I so vividly remember this case of McDonald's, the McDonald's coffee. It was the talk everywhere. Like, how far back does this go?
Mid-90s.
Mid-90s.
Yeah, it was an elderly lady who had purchased coffee from McDonald's, and she, I believe, had put the cup of coffee in between her legs. And for some reason, either the top came off or it spilled, and she got some really catastrophic third-degree burns to her leg area. And it was a big case. They tried to get the case resolved with McDonald's early on for a fairly nominal amount. McDonald's rejected their offer, didn't want to pay anything, so a lawsuit was filed. The lady ultimately prevailed, and I think she was awarded $160,000 in compensatory damages and over $2 million in punitive damages. And one of the big issues in the case was how hot is too hot from a coffee standpoint. And it drew a lot of publicity. Ultimately, the case was resolved during appeal for a confidential settlement amount. But to sort of drive home the point that we're going to be talking about here today, apparently they had some proof or evidence in that case that the coffee's temperature at the time they were serving it to people was around 180 to 190 degrees. Jeez. Super hot. To put that in perspective, boiling hot water is 212 degrees.
See, that's not good. Yeah. And so that brought about changes at McDonald's, and she won the case. And that's a part of what I remember is how massive the settlement was.
Yeah, and, well, I don't know about the settlement. That was actually the verdict. They settled it for a lesser amount on appeal. But why the case got so much publicity is that it was back during the day when tort reform was real popular, yes. And the corporations jumped on this as a justification to try and get some type of tort reform passed so that damages like this couldn't be awarded.
Now, the reason we're talking about this, and as kind of a transition here, how hot is too hot? You actually had a case where that question came into play in a courtroom or in a legal setting.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally different situation than coffee, but I did have an occasion to represent a young lady in her early 20s that had been diagnosed at a pretty young age with epilepsy. And as you know, epilepsy can come with having seizures, grand mal seizures, petit mal seizures, things of that nature. And so she had suffered from that for quite some time. She had gotten some medication. They had gotten it under control. And for the first time, she was moving out of her house and going to live alone. She got an apartment by herself. And about 3 weeks into her rental term, she had a situation where she had taken her clothes off. She was getting ready to take a shower. She had turned the water on inside the bathtub. It was a single nozzle where you can rotate it left or right for the cold and hot water. And as she was getting ready to get into the shower, she again had taken her clothes off. She had a grand mal seizure, and she falls into the bathtub, where these seizures typically last around 3 minutes or so before you start to come to, where she literally had 150 degree plus water come down on her entire chest and stomach area. And she sustained 3rd degree burns to her stomach and chest area, was in the UAB burn unit for about 4 or 5 weeks. So we represented her in a case against the apartment complex.
So why is the temperature of water so important in terms of safety?
Well, there's a lot of literature out there on this, and I think that one reason it's so important is, unlike lawyers looking at this type of stuff or safety experts, lay people look at these things in very simplistic terms, right? I want hot water when I take a shower. I want hot water when I'm washing my hands. They don't really look at it from the standpoint of, is this exposing me to something unsafe? Is it exposing me to risk that are potentially very, very catastrophic? And that's why the temperature setting on these water heaters and in a lot of contexts are so very important, because at 150 plus degrees, you can sustain a 3rd degree burn in 3 seconds or less. Okay? That is a very quick time period. And if you've ever had an occasion to do any type of testing, if you ever have 150 degree water coming out of a faucet, you will not be able to keep your hand under there for more than a half a second. You'll literally put it under there and you'll feel it and you'll pull it right back out. And so that's why the temperature setting is so important in these situations.
Is there not a standard to where it cannot exceed? I would think it makes sense to not have water ever be able to come out of like in a home setting in a way that'll give you a 3rd degree burn.
Well, that is a fair question, and that question has been asked of water heater manufacturers around the country. The problem is, you have to remember, the water heater in your house is not just supplying water to your bathtub, shower, and your sink. It's also supplying hot water to your dishwasher, to your washing machine for clothes. Okay. So manufacturers of washing machines and dishwashers, they may advocate for a higher temperature in order to fully clean clothes, fully clean dishes, and things of that nature. So you're really trying to find a fine balance, right? You're doing a risk-benefit analysis. You're trying to find a balance between all of your household needs, where you're not tipping over, where you're exposing somebody to great risk. And the standards out there, I would contend, they're different schools of thought on this, but somewhere between 130 to maybe 135 degrees seems to be sort of an acceptable temperature setting range on these water heaters that will allow you to do everything you would need to do in a dishwasher or washing machine, but at the same time keep you safe when you're taking showers and provide you with enough hot water.
All right, so this young lady came to you seeking help. She had these injuries. What kind of an investigation did you do for her?
Well, she got to us probably about 2 months after the incident occurred. And at that time, she had to go back to the apartment where she was living, where the incident happened. So when she contacted us, we immediately went over to the apartment complex. We got an understanding as to what happened. And it didn't take long for us to go over to the kitchen sink or to the subject bathtub, turn the nozzle all the way to hot, and realize this was extremely hot water coming out. Went back over there, had some technicians come over there. We did some testing. The water was coming out in the bathtub area and in the kitchen sink at anywhere from 152 to 154, 155 degrees. So right then, we took that information, we compared it to the standards that were out there, and we realized we might have something there in terms of a viable case. We also learned that the water heater, there were individual water heaters per individual unit. So we ultimately got to the water heater in her apartment, and what we immediately realized is that the older water heaters, a lot are tankless water heaters now, but the old big white ones that you have, it has a panel on it, and when you remove the panel, it's got insulation on it,
right.
Okay? That insulation panel covers up the thermostat, all right? There's a reason for that. You don't want the thermostat on your water heater being influenced by the ambient temperature in the room if you're running your air conditioning, right? Well, the panel was off. It was tucked away kind of in below a closet and a door that you had to remove it. The panel was off. There was no insulation on there. The actual temperature setting on the thermostat was around 147 and 148 degrees. But the reason it was coming out at 5 degrees hotter was because it was being influenced by the room temperature. So the heating elements of the water heater were working more than they should have, heating the water up more than it should have been heated up.
And now when you realized that, when you saw that, is that the moment you kind of thought, hey, we've got a case here?
Yeah.
Or was there something
Yeah.
else?
At that point in time, we certainly, coupled with the catastrophic permanent nature of her injuries, knew we felt really confident about the case, so a lawsuit was filed at that point.
All right, so let's take a break. On the other side, I want to get into kind of you walk us through the case and what happened and pick it up from there. We'll take a break. We're coming back. We'll have more of the Law Talk podcast right after this quick break.
At Hollis Wright, we don't cut corners when helping our clients. Financial resources matter, and we know it. If it's a car accident, a work injury, or a defective product, we have the resources to help. Let Hollis Wright tell your comeback story.
The attorneys, proudly sponsored by the law firm of Hollis Wright, are here to serve you.
When we started the show in 2011, my goal was to do what our firm does best. Help people answer questions related to real-world legal issues they have in their lives in a way that's not intimidating to talk with a lawyer. If the issue is important to you, it's equally important to us, and we're ready to talk with you at no cost.
Yeah, oftentimes people are confronting various legal issues in their lives that really run the gamut of a lot of different legal practice areas, such as bankruptcy, criminal law, civil law, such as personal injury, divorces, domestic relations. And to be able to have a show once a week that covers those practice areas and answers people's questions in those areas, that's really the main objective of the show.
We use the resources of the many lawyers at our law firm to create a plan that has a lasting impact for each person that calls or texts. And we also give back to the community at the same time. We are here to serve you, the viewer, each week on The Attorneys.
Welcome back into the Law Talk podcast here with Carter Clay from Hollis Wright, talking about how hot is too hot, kind of springboarding off the McDonald's coffee case from the 90s, but you had an example of a young lady you were represented. She got burned. How, what were the degree of the burns?
3rd degree, which is basically full thickness burns where you've got to have skin grafting.
Yeah, where she's taking a bath and the water coming out was way too hot, way too hot. All right, so you kind of led us up to the point to where you found something that kind of warranted a case and helped the case. So pick it up from there.
Yeah, so we filed a lawsuit, and as you know, David, we did a lot of discovery, which would include taking depositions. One of the couple of things that we learned in the case that were critically important is, number one, is we learned that the industry standard across the board, and even at this apartment complex, they were following this standard, is you do a pre-lease inspection. Okay. And they have a checklist of items that they're supposed to be checking, one of which was water heater is functioning, right? They did all of that. The problem, though, is that the standards really compelled them to not only make sure that they had hot water coming out in the complex, but to determine the temperature setting on the water heater, and they did not do that. And one of the interesting parts in the case was I was taking the deposition of the property manager, and he testified that not only did they check to make sure there was hot water in the unit, but that they were also supposed to be checking the thermostat on the water heater to make sure that it was set at a reasonable level, that 130, 135 degree level. And so that was the testimony that he gave. But fast forward 2 months later, I'm actually taking the depositions of the actual maintenance people that conduct the pre-lease inspections, and they testified that about 2 months ago, which coincides with when I took the property manager's deposition, that the property manager came back to them and told them they needed to start checking the temperature setting on the water heater. And they also testified that prior to the property manager telling them that they had never been trained or told to actually go and check the thermostat temperature setting. So that was a critical moment in the case.
When you come across admissions like that, I mean, I would think that's, like the critical moment, like that's the crux of the case right there.
It absolutely was. And of course, the defense attorney that was defending the apartment complex, he had his head down and was just taking notes feverishly, never looked up. It was not a good moment for him. It was a great moment for me and for really more importantly for our client.
Yeah. An aside, we'll get back to this conversation, but are you ever surprised at just in those depositions, things that people do admit that this is sinking your case?
Yes and no. I mean, obviously they're supposed to tell the truth,
right.
And if you've got a good case and you know what the truth is, you want them to tell the truth, and sometimes the truth is just really bad for them and it does sink their case. But it does happen from time to time, but you don't always get those types of hot moments in a case.
Yeah, probably not always as clear cut as that. All right, so what was the outcome of the case?
So we ultimately resolved the case confidentially. We went to mediation, and it's the only time I've ever done this in a mediation, but I knew that these injuries had such a compelling effect, permanent effect on my client. I actually had her prepare a statement, maybe 1 or 2 minute statement, really 2 or 3 minutes, I guess, where she actually read the statement about how these injuries had impacted her life to the other side and the liability insurance adjuster that was there. So that was a unique part about the case. But one of the interesting aspects that I want to share with you about the case is the extent to which we had to prove the case. So it wasn't as simple as just saying, well, the industry standard is 130 to 135 degrees and the water was coming out at 153 or 154 degrees. One of the things that we had to prove in the case is that had they complied with the industry standard of 130 to 135 degrees, these injuries would have been avoided or would have been substantially lessened, right? So think about it this way. They could have come back and said, well, great, Carter, if we had set it at 130 to 135 degrees, she was still going to be exposed to 135 degree temperatures over the course of 3 minutes while she's having this seizure. They could have argued, we think the injuries would have still been the same. So that then begs the question of what? How long, if at all, does it take to get burned from 130 to 135 degree type temperatures? That's where it became complicated because you can sustain third degree burns within around a minute or so of exposure. But then let's complicate it a little bit further. When the water goes through the pipes and starts to come out of the faucet, and as it hits the ambient room temperature, it's coming down. And it's coming down considerably over a 3 minute period of time. So we actually retained the services of a forensic engineering expert in Texas that literally we had a bathtub. We had temperatures, elements in a bathtub. We ran it at 130, 135 degrees. We timed everything for 3 minutes. And what we learned is that during the course of 3 minutes, it was dropping down into the 110, 115, 120 range. And when you get down into those temperature ranges, it takes many, many minutes to sustain a third degree burn. So that was our proof. That was the nail in the coffin, so to speak, the final element of proof, in my judgment, to tie this thing in a nice bow.
All right. So, so for her, how did it all end up? How did the case finish up?
Well, again, we resolved the case at mediation. Ultimately, we were pretty close to trial, and we got the case resolved.
Yeah, and she was happy with that. I would assume.
Yeah, she's happy with that. She's doing well. She's actually she got pregnant, had a little girl several years ago, and so she's doing really well. Yeah.
What do you think with a case like this? What are the takeaways, especially if the folks that are listening and maybe one day may need an attorney for something? What can we take away from this case?
Well, what I would encourage people to do is don't take such a simplistic view of I want hot water in my house. I want my coffee to be hot. I would encourage people to look a little bit deeper, to analyze the situation a little bit more, and think about the 1 or 2 year old child that's taking a bath. Think about the elderly parent who's living alone and falls down. Think if you have an Airbnb or a VRBO or if you're at a hotel, these things matter a lot. Now, granted, if you've got a 1 or 2 year old little child that is in the bathtub, the parents are supposed to be there watching them to some extent. But as a parent, you would think realistically or reasonably that you would be able to take your eye off your child for 4 or 5 seconds and they wouldn't get 3rd-degree burns. But when you have temperatures that are that high and coming out of the faucet, or if you've got an elderly parent that falls down, it can happen very quickly. And the truth of the matter is, there's no need to have the temperature that hot. You can't withstand that type of temperature in the shower or bathtub anyway. It's going to have to be much lower anyway. And so I would just encourage people to look at that. In fact, I know from experience that plumbers who are installing these water heaters, they will not, if you ask them, hey, I want you to turn the temperature up to 140, 145 degrees, they're trained, if they're reputable, they're trained not to do that. They'll say, look, the factory setting is at 130 or 135 degrees. We're not authorized to change the temperatures any higher because it's unsafe.
Could be an injury. Yeah. Wild stuff. You got to watch that water.
Yeah.
Watch the water. How hot is too hot? We found out today for sure. I feel like I'm much more educated on my water now.
Well, you need to go home and check the temperature
I'm going to go take. I can't wait to go take a shower just to see where I am, see where I rate on this hot water factor. Carter, it's always good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thanks so much for hanging out with us. And Carter, you'll find him hollis-wright.com, the website. You can learn more about Carter Clay. You can just check him out there. Also all over social media as well. We appreciate you being with us. We'll see you next time here on the Law Talk Podcast.